I'm Justine Rosenthal, editor of the National Interest, and I am privileged to be here today with Dave Keene, who is the chairman of the
Presidents get paid, chairman.
the figurehead and leader of the American Conservative Union, and we are hoping to talk today about the future of the Republican Party. Let me first just come out of the gates and say to you, is the Republican Party in crisis?
Well, whenever a party loses the White House and Congress, it goes through a period of soul searching. People within the party decide that they're out of power because they believe the wrong things, because they did the wrong things, because they weren't able to communicate effectively. And usually those fights go on. It's gone on in the Republican Party before. It went on in the Democratic Party, as you know, when they were getting their act together. In a two-party system, though, the minority party is as important as the majority party, for the simple reason that, as in professional football, on a given day, either team can win. And the Republican Party and the Democratic Party have periodically been counted out of the game by all the observers and by many of their own members, only to find themselves winners 4 years or 8 years down the road.
Dave, some people say that the Republican Party is in a worse crisis than it may have been in its history, that largely the Republican Party has been in ascendance in this country, that Americans have always thought of themselves more as conservatives, and that there are people sort of handing in their GOP cards.
Well, interestingly, the Republican Party brand right now is badly seen by most voters, most Americans. But at the same time, those very same voters, those very same Americans, describe themselves, as they did when the Republican Party was in ascendancy, as conservative. On issue after issue, even the exit polls, as Barack Obama was winning the White House, showed that the voters were much closer to the Republican positions on a myriad of issues than they were to the Democratic position. And in fact, what's happening as we speak is that Barack Obama is running up against that, because the proposals that he's floated, particularly the domestic proposals, have come up against a wall of public attitudes that reject many of the approaches that he's taking. So that even before the Republicans started to get their act together on the whole health care debate, polls, particularly a Washington Post poll, showed that the public was very skeptical of many of the claims that the administration was making. The American public is relatively conservative and has been for some time. You know, those things change. When I was in college a long time ago, 2 or 3 times as many Americans viewed themselves as liberal as conservative than did conservative. That's almost the opposite now, not quite the opposite. But so the Republican Party's problem is not that they've been out of step with the views of the American public, but that the American public has viewed their performance as quite different from their philosophical positions and rejected that performance. Basically what happened in 2008, when you take out of the equation the fact that Barack Obama was a very attractive candidate, that the Republicans had been in long enough that there was fatigue, if you will, and it really came down to the fact that the American people wanted to fire the Republican Party because they didn't think they were doing a very good job.
So you see it as a performance review rather than an ideological dispute. I guess one of the things that I wonder about that, was it part performance review, but also partly what the Republican Party had become during the Bush administration didn't necessarily reflect those conservative views.
The Bush administration, the performance was related to what the Bush administration and the Republican leadership in Congress had become. For example, conservatives from the very beginning had been saying you cannot go off and spend money like a drunken sailor because the base of your party doesn't want that. This is a party that success has depended in the past on a clear vision of the kind of government that it supports. A smaller rather than larger government, lower rather than higher taxes, less rather than more spending, more rather than less individual freedom. And while the Republicans continued with that rhetoric, during the middle Bush years, you had a party that was spending at a more rapid rate than any administration since Lyndon Johnson's when he launched the Great Society. You had an administration that, in the name of national security, was adopting measure after measure that came up against the public's feeling about individual liberties. You had an administration that was far more adventurous abroad, if you will, than most Americans had thought Republicans always were. One of the reasons that Republicans tended to win on national security issues in the past and on foreign policy issues was that the public, like Republicans, believed that the world is a dangerous place and that if you're going to live in that world, you ought to be strong, but that you don't go off into that world trying to change it or doing things. You protect yourself. And the Republicans sort of became Democrats internationally and Democrats domestically. And as a result, the public sort of looked at it and said, this isn't what you want. Now, did that mean that massive numbers of Republicans deserted their party? No. I mean, in this country, if 5 or 6% of your base decides to stay home, or if independents begin to move because they don't see any reason to stay with you, you get a big victory on the other side. And in fact, that's what happened. In 2006, it wasn't taken as a significant enough warning, and by 2008, the American public was ready to look for something else. Now, is that the end for Republicans? No. One of the reasons that in our two-party system it tends to go back and forth is that the public gets tired with whoever's in because they promise to solve all their problems and make life wonderful. And after a certain number of years, voters find out they still have problems in their life. It might be nice, but it's not wonderful. So they say, well, we'll fire them and try the other guys. The other guys get in, and after a few years, they find out that they couldn't solve all their problems. Now, both parties overpromise. And then when they win, and this is the real problem that winning politicians have and why the system corrects itself. Whenever a politician wins, he or she concludes that everybody voted for him because they agreed with him. Not because they wanted to fire the other guy. Not because they didn't understand the issues. Not because the economy was bad or the war was unpopular, but because of them and because of what they think. And the result of that is that they decide that they have a mandate to do not what the voters necessarily wanted them to do, but to do what they've always wanted to do. So that back in the early Clinton administration, you remember Bill Clinton saying he had a mandate he and his wife did for a national health care system, though he'd only mentioned it in one speech during his campaign and then only in passing. But he actually decided that the people who voted for him wanted that because he did. The Obama administration is doing the same things, only it's as if they're on steroids. They've decided that because they would like to change the whole economic structure of the United States economy, that must have been what the voters wanted when they elected him. And when that happens, a winning politician tends to overreach. And when the overreach takes place, the backlash sets in, and then the other party begins to gain. That, in historic terms, is the real reason why the out party tends to gain seats in the off election, because there's a reaction against the overreaching of the in party. And it happens to Republicans and it happens to Democrats. So the Republican fortunes, all other things being equal, will be looking up in 2010.
Whether they do anything to change.
I said all other things being equal, but if you're out, if you're part of a party that's out, you can't control what the party that's in is doing. What you can control is yourself. You can begin to get your own act together, and the introspection that comes with a loss can be healthy rather than divisive. It's always a little divisive because everybody starts to argue. But out of the argument should come a sense of what it is you are and where you want to go. These arguments are always the same, as I said a few minutes earlier. Were we wrong? Did we perform badly? Were the other guys that good? I remember being at a conference some years ago at Princeton on the past, future, present and future of American conservatism. And David Brooks, the New York Times columnist, was asked to speak on the future of American conservatism. And he gave a speech, and M. Stanton Evans, one of the real founders of the modern movement, was there, and Stan got up and he said, "David, that was a very good speech, but I've heard it before." He said, "I think Nelson Rockefeller gave it in 1967. And the fact is that in politics, at the base, very little changes. The arguments are the same. The solutions tend to be the same. The question is, where do you stand with your beliefs and how do you apply them to the problems of the day? after Watergate, when the Republican Party, in the view of many people, was on the verge of vanishing. And there was this whole debate going on about how the party had to change and it had to abandon its positions it had taken. Ronald Reagan stood up and said, no, if the Republican Party wants to come back, it should march, as he put it, under a banner of bold colors rather than pale pastels. It should not ape the opposing party. It should stand for what it stands for. And he gave that speech in 1975, and 5 years later, he was president of the United States.